She stood in her own kitchen, holding divorce papers in one hand and her daughter's hand in the other, and the woman standing beside her husband smiled like she'd already won the house, the life, and the privilege of being the one who stayed. That was the moment everything changed. Not because it was the worst moment, it wasn't, but because it was the moment when a woman who had spent 22 years being invisible in plain sight finally understood that she didn't need anyone's permission to fight back. I need to tell you about this because what happened next isn't the story people usually tell about betrayal. It's not about rage or legal battles that drag on forever. It's about what happens when someone who spent 2 decades learning how to stay calm in actual combat situations is forced to stay calm in their own home. And how that impossible composure turns out to have been preparation for something larger than anyone in that kitchen could have imagined. Her name was Victoria, and she was a colonel in the United States military. She'd spent 22 years climbing toward that single rank through 14 deployments, through missed birthdays and Thanksgivings reheated in military kitchens, through learning to sleep through the sound of incoming mortars, and then, which was somehow worse, learning to sleep through the absolute silence when she finally came home. The promotion ceremony that morning had been the kind that military people understand in their bones. No pomp, no unnecessary drama, just a room full of people who recognized what the climb had actually cost. Her commanding general had pinned the eagle himself, held her hand a fraction longer than protocol required, and said something she would carry with her forever. "Victoria, you earned every molecule of this the hard way." She thanked him, and she meant it, but her mind was already somewhere else. She was thinking about Marcus, her husband of 11 years. She was thinking about how his face would look when she told him. She was thinking about their daughter, Emma, who was 8 years old and had a way of bouncing when she was proud of someone she loved. Victoria was thinking about what it would feel like to finally be seen by him, really seen, not as the reliable military spouse who was conveniently absent half the time, but as someone who had actually accomplished something significant. She didn't mention any of this to her colleagues. That's not what you do when some of the men in that room are still adjusting to the fact that you've just been promoted past them. So Victoria kept it folded up, the way she kept everything that mattered too much to risk saying wrong. Everything tidy, everything controlled. She picked Emma up from school at 3:15 in the afternoon, still wearing the dress uniform with its new insignia, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar with the weight of the rank she'd fought for. Emma spotted her through the chain-link fence before Victoria had even parked the car. She came running with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, blonde hair coming loose from its braid, and she stopped short when she saw the eagle on Victoria's collar. "Mommy, you look different," Emma said, breathless, tilting her head like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Is that new?" Victoria crouched down to her daughter's height and felt something settle in her chest, the kind of clarity you feel when you know you're about to share something that matters. "It's new," she told her, "and guess what it means." When Emma understood, when Victoria explained the rank and what it represented, her daughter's eyes went wide in a way that made Victoria feel, for just a moment, like she had finally climbed high enough that someone would actually see her. Emma insisted they celebrate. She talked Victoria into stopping at a small bakery on Barton Springs Road, the kind of neighborhood place that had been serving the same neighborhood for decades, and they picked out 2 small cakes with strawberries pressed into white frosting. Emma carried the box on her lap the entire drive home like it was made of something fragile. She kept narrating what her father's reaction would be. "Daddy's going to be so proud," she said more than once, testing the words like she was trying them on for size. "He's going to say you're the strongest mom in America." Victoria let her daughter believe it. At that moment, she still believed it too. Whatever had gone cold between Marcus and Victoria over the past year, the late nights he explained away, the phone he angled from view, the distance that had crept into their marriage like a slow leak, you don't notice until you're already soaked. She still thought that this would matter to him. She still believed that 22 years of service and sacrifice would mean something to the person she'd built her life around. She still thought foolishly that he would want to celebrate this with her. They pulled into the driveway of their Austin home a little after 5 o'clock. It was a good house, the kind of mid-century modern home that had appreciated steadily over the years, in a neighborhood where young professionals and military families lived in careful proximity to each other. The porch light was already on, which struck Victoria as strange in the remaining daylight. A car she didn't recognize was parked at the curb, sleek white, dealer plate still attached. Emma didn't notice anything unusual. She was already unbuckling herself, cake box balanced carefully, chattering about lighting candles even though it wasn't a birthday. Victoria noticed everything. 22 years of reading rooms before you walk into them doesn't shut off just because you're home. Marcus was standing in the doorway before Victoria had even gotten her key out. Beside him stood a woman in a fitted navy blazer, dark hair pulled back, wearing an expression like she'd been waiting for this moment and was pleased with how it was unfolding. On the kitchen island behind them, visible through the open door, was a manila folder, thick enough that Victoria recognized what it was before anyone said a word. Divorce papers. Victoria, Marcus said, and he didn't even look at the eagle on her collar. He didn't offer any greeting beyond her name, no mention of what she'd accomplished that morning, no recognition of anything except his own predetermined script. This marriage is over. Emma's grip on Victoria's hand tightened. Victoria felt it before she processed the words. That small squeeze, her daughter's body understanding something was wrong before her mind caught up. The woman beside Marcus, her name was Rosalind, though Victoria didn't have her name yet, looked her up and down with something between amusement and contempt. The way you'd assess furniture you'd decided to replace. Pack your bags, soldier, Rosalind said, and smiled like she'd been waiting all day to use that tone. She meant it as an insult. Victoria could have argued. She could have demanded explanations, given them the scene they were clearly braced for, asked the 1,000 questions that were suddenly flooding her mind. Instead, she looked past both of them, past the folder on the counter, past 20 years of memory stacked in every room of that house, and she felt something in her go very still and very quiet. The same stillness she'd learned in briefings where the wrong reaction could cost lives. That kind of stillness. She said, very quietly, "Okay." And Rosalind's smile faltered just slightly. "What's funny?" the other woman asked. "I don't know yet," Victoria said, her voice almost gentle. "But you will be." Marcus laughed a short, dismissive bark, cutting her off before she could continue, pulling the floor back beneath him the way he always did when he wanted a room to remember who he thought was in charge. "The house is mine after the divorce," he said, flat and certain like he was reading terms he'd already memorized. "You can take your things and go, Victoria. I'll be reasonable about the furniture." Rosalind didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past Marcus into the front hallway and began moving through the house like she already owned it. Fingers trailing along the banister, pausing at the living room entrance to judge the paint color, the bookshelves, the framed photo of Emma's first day of kindergarten on the mantel. Victoria watched her study the home the way a real estate agent studies a listing. And something in Victoria, some old, disciplined part that had learned patience in places far more dangerous than this kitchen, decided to let her keep walking. Victoria didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She took Emma's hand and led her upstairs instead, away from the noise, away from the invasion. She helped her daughter gather a few things into her backpack, her favorite stuffed rabbit, a sweater, the drawing she'd made in art class that she wasn't finished being proud of. Emma was quiet the whole time, watching Victoria's face for cues on how worried she should be. Victoria kept her expression steady because that was the one thing she could still control. "Are we leaving, Mommy?" Emma whispered. "Just for tonight," Victoria told her, which was true, though not in any way Emma could have understood at that moment. "Let me pause here because I need to be honest with you about what happens next. Most people, when they're in this position, when they've just been humiliated in their own home, when they've watched someone they trusted dismiss them like they're nothing, most people would panic. They'd call a lawyer frantically. They'd start moving money around. They'd do something reactive. Victoria didn't do any of that. And that's not because she's tougher than everyone else or more together, or any of the things people would later claim. It's because she'd already done the hard part years earlier. She'd already prepared for the exact scenario she was now living through. Before she left, Victoria went to the small fireproof safe, bolted to the floor of her closet, the one Marcus had never once asked about in 11 years of marriage, which tells you something important about what he'd never bothered to understand about her. She removed a thin folder she'd kept there, since long before she and Marcus had said their vows at the courthouse. It was a title deed. Marcus, watching from the hallway, assumed it had something to do with joint accounts, some scrambled attempt to protect shared assets. He didn't ask. He just watched her with the smug patience of a man who thought he'd already won. Victoria didn't correct him. She walked downstairs, set her house key gently on the counter beside the divorce papers, a gesture that wasn't surrender but goodbye, and looked at both of them one last time. "Enjoy your evening," she said. And she meant it more than they could possibly understand. That night, Victoria and Emma checked into a hotel near the military base. Emma fell asleep faster than Victoria expected, exhausted from a day that had scrambled every expectation she'd walked into. Victoria lay awake beside her daughter, not out of grief, but out of something closer to clarity. 22 years in uniform teaches you to separate emotion from action. Grieve later. Move now. So Victoria didn't cry for her marriage that night. She made phone calls. She called an attorney she'd retained 8 years earlier, specifically for exactly this contingency, though she'd hoped never to use her. She called a financial advisor. She arranged the timing of what would happen next, with the same precision she'd once used to coordinate logistics for classified military operations. Back at the house, Marcus and Rosalind were celebrating like the war was already over. Victoria heard about it later, the way these things always surface through neighborhood gossip and mutual acquaintances. A bottle of champagne opened in Victoria's kitchen. Toasts made to a future neither of them had any legal claim to. Rosalind had apparently already started talking about paint colors for the guest room, about which of her furniture would replace Victoria's. Marcus, riding high on the feeling of finally outmaneuvering someone, let her dream out loud without correction. Neither of them knew that the expiration date on that dream was measured in hours, not days. The next morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, a process server arrived at the house. Victoria knows this because she'd arranged the timing herself the night before, one of several calls she'd made from that hotel room while Emma slept. Marcus answered the door in his robe, coffee in hand, probably expecting a package. Instead, he was handed a legal notice that was going to reshape everything he thought he understood. The notice was simple, 3 pages, prepared by an attorney who specialized in military family law, and had seen enough situations like this to know exactly what language would hold up. It stated in plain and uncontestable legal language that the house at their Austin address was titled solely in Victoria's name, that it had been purchased and fully paid for before she and Marcus were married, that under Texas state law it did not constitute marital property and was therefore not subject to division in any divorce proceeding. 1 folder. 3 pages. The end of every assumption Marcus had built his identity on. Marcus called Victoria 11 times before noon. She didn't answer any of them. Some conversations are better had in a courtroom where the facts speak instead of the feelings and the pride get in the way of the truth. By early afternoon, according to what Emma's babysitter later told Victoria, she'd stopped by to drop off a forgotten homework folder. Rosalind had read the legal notice over Marcus's shoulder and gone very pale, then very loud. Impossible, she was reported to have said. Like she could argue with a title deed simply by refusing to accept it. This has to be a mistake. It has to be. But it wasn't a mistake. What it was 11 years of quiet decisions. 11 years of careful financial independence. 11 years of Marcus never bothering to ask questions about the details of his own life because he'd been too busy constructing a narrative about who was in charge. And now all of that had arrived at the worst possible moment for him, with the force of a legal judgment he couldn't argue with or convince his way around. I want to pause here because I need to tell you something about what it feels like when you realize you've been underestimated by someone you actually trusted. It's not the kind of thing most people talk about, but I think Victoria would want you to know this. The moment when you understand that another person has built their entire sense of themselves on lies about you, on their version of who you are, rather than who you actually are, that moment is sometimes sadder than the betrayal itself. Because it means that person was never actually seeing you at all. They were just looking at whatever version of you fit the story they were telling themselves. By the time Victoria returned Marcus's calls 2 days later, his voice had lost every trace of the confidence he'd been wearing like armor in her kitchen. He'd hired his own attorney by then, a sharp young man named Curtis who specialized, according to his website, in aggressive asset recovery. Curtis had reviewed the title documents, the notarized dates, the bank records showing the down payment had cleared 8 months before Victoria and Marcus had exchanged vows. He told Marcus, in the careful language lawyers use when they're delivering bad news to a client who doesn't want to hear it, that the paperwork was airtight. There was nothing to contest. That was the moment Marcus finally understood something he should have learned years earlier. Victoria had never once hidden anything from him. He simply hadn't paid attention. He hadn't asked. The truth came out slowly over the following days, not because Victoria was withholding it, but because Marcus had never bothered to ask the right questions when it mattered. Years before she met him, back when Victoria was a captain stationed overseas, she'd used her deployment bonuses and a habit of saving nearly everything she earned to purchase a modest three-bedroom house in Austin through an estate sale, back when the neighborhood was still affordable and nobody was competing for it. It had been her safety net, her quiet insurance policy against a world that doesn't always treat single women in uniform with kindness or fairness. When she and Marcus married and eventually moved into that same house, he simply assumed, because she never corrected him and because he never asked, that it had been purchased jointly, the way most married couples buy their homes. She let him believe it because it never occurred to her that the truth would someday matter this much. She'd paid for it with her own money, in her own name, and had never hidden that fact. He'd just never thought to ask about it. Marcus tried calling 17 times over 3 days. Victoria finally answered on the 4th day. Mostly because Emma kept asking why Daddy sounded so upset on the voicemails she wasn't supposed to be listening to. "You let me think it was ours," he said. And there was real anger in his voice. Real hurt. Though Victoria noted he didn't apologize for the divorce papers, or for Rosalind, or for however many months this had been building before she walked in, holding her daughter's hand with a cake box. "You never asked whose name was on the deed, Marcus," Victoria said, her voice level. "In 11 years, you never once asked. And I never lied to you. I just didn't volunteer information you didn't seem to care enough to ask about." He didn't have an answer for that because there wasn't one. Some truths are only uncomfortable once you realize how long you spent avoiding looking at them. Rosalind's patience, meanwhile, was fraying fast. She'd moved several boxes of her belongings into the house that first celebratory night, so certain of her new address that she'd barely waited for anything to be finalized. Now those boxes sat in the garage, unpacked, while she and Marcus argued in tones the neighbors could apparently hear through open windows. She had believed, according to what Victoria later pieced together, everything Marcus had told her, that he was a successful executive, that the house was a shared asset they could leverage, that marrying into him meant marrying into security. She had not planned for a scenario where the boring army wife turned out to hold every card in an unfairly distributed deck. She'd been sold a fantasy, and now that fantasy was dissolving in real time, and she was discovering that her anger couldn't change a title deed. "But I want you to understand something about Rosalind, because she's important to this story. She's not purely evil here. She's just a person who made a choice based on false information, and now she's living with the consequences. She believed what she was told. That doesn't excuse her behavior toward Victoria. Nothing excuses walking into someone's home and treating them with contempt, but it explains it. And understanding the explanation is what keeps this story from being just about revenge and becomes instead about something more complicated, about how people construct stories about each other, and what happens when reality refuses to match the narrative." Emma, for her part, was handling the upheaval with more grace than any adult in this story deserved. She'd started treating the hotel room and their small temporary apartment like it was a new home she was settling into for the long term. She arranged her stuffed animals along the windowsill like she was nesting. When Marcus called to arrange a visit, she took the phone from Victoria with a seriousness that made Victoria's chest tighten. "I don't want to go stay with you right now," Emma told him, her voice small but steady. "I want to stay with Mom." She didn't cry when she said it. She didn't make it dramatic. She just stated a fact with the same clarity her mother had learned to use. Victoria heard Marcus try to argue gently at first, then with more urgency, but Emma held her ground the way she'd watched her mother hold hers. Politely, calmly, without raising her voice, but also without moving an inch. When Emma handed the phone back to Victoria, her chin was lifted in a way that reminded Victoria so much of herself at that age, that it nearly undid the composure she'd been so carefully maintaining. "Here's what I want to say about Victoria's daughter, because I think this matters." Emma wasn't being cruel or punitive. She was doing what children do when they observe someone they love, standing firm in their own truth. She was learning that you can disagree with someone you love, that you can step away from them, and that doing so doesn't make you a bad person. She was learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept a version of normal that requires you to shrink. Marcus's last call that week wasn't about Emma or about reconciliation, or even about the house directly. It was about control and the slow, dawning realization that he had none left. He'd built his sense of authority in their marriage on assumptions that Victoria was too busy, too deployed, too absorbed in her career to notice the details of their shared life. He'd never imagined that the woman he considered too plain, too rigid, too military to be interesting, had spent years quietly building a foundation he knew nothing about. "You've been planning this?" he said finally, and Victoria could hear something close to fear underneath the accusation. "No, Marcus," Victoria told him, and for the first time in days, she let a little of what she actually felt into her voice. "I've just always paid attention to my own life. You should try it sometime." She hung up before he could respond. But the house was only the beginning. 2 weeks into the separation, Marcus discovered something that unsettled him even more than the deed ever had. Their joint checking account, the one they'd used for years to cover groceries, utilities, Emma's school expenses, held barely enough to cover a month of bills. He called Victoria in a tone somewhere between accusation and panic, demanding to know where their money had gone, as if she'd siphoned it away in the night. Victoria hadn't taken anything. That was the part he couldn't grasp. The joint account had always been exactly what it sounded like, a shared account for shared everyday expenses. It had never been where her real savings lived. Marcus had been depositing his salary and drawing from that same joint account for household costs for over a decade, assuming it represented the full financial picture. It never had. What Marcus didn't know he was only now beginning to piece together through his own accountant, a man clearly unaccustomed to delivering news like this, was that Victoria had spent 15 years quietly building a separate financial life. Deployment pay that most people squandered on nothing in particular, she'd funneled into low-cost index funds. Housing allowances she hadn't needed, since the house was already paid for, she'd redirected into a modest but steadily growing portfolio of dividend stocks. 3 years earlier, she'd purchased a small rental property near the base, an unglamorous 2-bedroom duplex that didn't photograph well, but paid reliably every month. None of it was extravagant. None of it was hidden in the dramatic sense Marcus wanted to believe. It simply wasn't his, and he'd never once asked whether it existed. During one particularly heated call, he said something that Victoria nearly laughed at. "You let me think we were struggling." Victoria could have been cruel in response. She could have pointed out that he was the one who'd walked into her kitchen with divorce papers and a girlfriend just weeks earlier, so his sense of what was fair or unfair seemed a little late in arriving. Instead, she kept her voice level. "I never told you we were struggling, Marcus. You told yourself a story about our life, and I let you keep believing it because it was easier than arguing with you about money every time I came home from deployment." The truth, when it finally settled over him, seemed to hit harder than the loss of the house itself. For 11 years, Marcus had operated under a quiet, comfortable assumption that he was the more capable partner in their marriage. The provider, the strategist, the one who understood money and status, and how the world actually worked. He'd built his identity partly around that assumption. Made comments over the years, some careless, some pointed, about her paycheck being steady but modest compared to the deals he closed. He'd never asked what she did with the difference. Now he was discovering that the wife he'd considered financially unremarkable had quietly outbuilt him in every measurable way without ever needing his help or his permission. And that discovery was breaking something in him that no legal loss could have reached. Rosalind's reaction when she learned the full scope of Victoria's separate wealth was worse than Marcus's. She'd entered this relationship with a specific picture in mind: a successful executive, a valuable house, a lifestyle upgrade. Watching that picture dissolve in real time, piece by piece, seemed to erode whatever patience she'd managed. The arguments between them grew louder and more frequent. A neighbor mentioned to Victoria carefully, almost apologetically, that she'd heard raised voices coming from the house on more than one evening. Rosalind's voice sharper and more persistent than Marcus's. "You told me you had money," she reportedly said to him. "You told me she was just some soldier who'd be easy to walk over. You told me this was already done." Marcus, for his part, was discovering in real time that the woman he'd left Victoria for had specific expectations about what their life together was supposed to look like. Expectations built on assumptions about wealth and stability that were rapidly proving false. Whatever affection had existed between them was buckling under the weight of financial disappointment and the slow realization that neither of them had understood the situation they were actually in. Victoria found she felt very little about their deteriorating relationship. She'd spent enough years compartmentalizing to know that other people's consequences weren't hers to carry. Instead, she focused on Emma, on keeping her daughter's routine steady despite the upheaval. Same bedtime, same breakfast, same walk to school when Victoria could manage it around her military schedule. Emma asked Victoria one evening, apropos of nothing, why Daddy sounded so tired on the phone lately. Grown-up things, Victoria told her, which wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth, the kind you're allowed to offer an 8-year-old. What she didn't tell Emma was that her father was discovering in real time exactly how much of his identity had been borrowed from assumptions he'd never bothered to verify. That the reckoning was only getting started, that sometimes when people build their entire sense of themselves on a story that turns out to be wrong, the collapse of that story can break them in ways they didn't think possible. The courtroom was smaller than people expect. All beige walls and fluorescent light, nothing like the dramatic wood-paneled rooms television trains you to imagine. Victoria arrived early, she does for everything, and chose to wear her army dress uniform rather than civilian clothes. Not for effect, though she understood it would have one, but because it was simply who she was, and she'd spent enough of her life softening that fact for other people's comfort, she wasn't going to do that anymore. Daniel, I mean. Marcus arrived with Curtis, his attorney, both of them in expensive suits that looked slightly too new, the kind of clothes purchased specifically for an occasion, rather than worn into familiarity. Marcus's confidence had returned somewhat by then, rebuilt through weeks of Curtis, assuring him that a judge might still see things his way, that 11 years of marriage carried weight regardless of what a deed said. Victoria understood the strategy. She simply didn't think it would work. Judge Rebecca Hill entered a few minutes past 9, reviewed the file in front of her with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen every version of this argument before. When she reached Victoria's paperwork, she looked up and paused for just a moment. "Good morning, Colonel Carter," she said, and something in her tone told Victoria that the judge had noticed the uniform, understood exactly what it represented, and respected it without needing to say so directly. The hearing moved through preliminary matters quickly. Custody arrangements for Emma, which Marcus's attorney barely contested given Emma's own clearly stated wishes, and then settled into the matter that had brought everyone into that room, the house. Curtis argued what he could. He gestured toward the length of the marriage. He gestured toward Marcus's financial contributions to the household over the years. He offered a vague notion of fairness that didn't hold up particularly well against a title deed with a purchase date 8 months before Victoria and Marcus's wedding. Victoria's attorney, Patricia Reyes, a measured woman who'd handled military family law for over a decade, simply laid out the documentation. Purchase agreement, closing statement, mortgage payoff records, all in Victoria's name, all predating the marriage by nearly a year. About as clean a case as Patricia had ever seen. Then Patricia called Margaret Lawson. Victoria hadn't seen Margaret in years. Not since the closing table where an elderly woman with sharp eyes and careful hands had transferred keys to her and told her something Victoria hadn't fully understood at the time. Margaret walked to the stand slowly, using a cane now, but her voice was still precise, still clear. The voice of a woman who'd spent 40 years practicing law before retiring to a quieter life. She explained that she had owned the house before Victoria, that she'd sold it directly, privately, without ever listing it on the open market. When Patricia asked her why she'd made that decision, Margaret's answer settled over the courtroom in a way Victoria hadn't expected. "I met Colonel Carter, Captain Carter at the time through a program connecting veterans with housing opportunities," Margaret said, her voice steady and certain. She had just come back from her 3rd deployment. She was exhausted in a way I recognized, because my own late husband served 2 tours in Vietnam, and came home carrying that same kind of tired. I decided I wanted to sell my house to someone who understood what it cost to serve this country, and I offered it to her well below market value because I believed she'd earned that consideration. I made sure every document was airtight in her name alone because I wanted her to have something in this world that no one could take from her. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest, unexpected and unwelcome in a courtroom. She kept her expression still, the way she'd trained herself to do for 2 decades. Marcus's face across the room had gone the color of old paper. Patricia asked a few more questions, confirming the timeline, confirming that Margaret had personally overseen every step of the sale, specifically to ensure no ambiguity could ever arise about ownership. Curtis, to his credit, didn't waste much effort trying to shake her testimony. There was nothing to shake. An 80-year-old retired attorney with a paper trail that airtight isn't a witness you cross-examine into contradiction. Judge Hill didn't take long to rule. She read from her notes in the flat, unhurried cadence judges use when they know exactly what they think. The house was unambiguously separate property purchased prior to the marriage, with documentation that left no room for the marital claim Marcus's attorney had attempted to construct. She granted the divorce. She awarded primary custody of Emma to Victoria, with generous visitation for Marcus, contingent on consistency and responsible behavior. She confirmed the house as solely Victoria's, free of any claim from the marriage that had, until 3 weeks ago, existed inside its walls. Marcus didn't look at Victoria as the ruling was read. He stared instead at some fixed point on the table in front of him. Victoria recognized the expression because she'd worn something like it herself once, years earlier, in a briefing room where a mission she'd planned for months fell apart in a single sentence. You don't forget what that kind of moment feels like. The moment when the ground shifts and you realize you've been operating on false assumptions the entire time. Victoria gathered her papers, nodded once to Margaret, who smiled at her with something like pride in her eyes, and walked out of that courtroom into the parking lot, where Emma was waiting with her grandmother, swinging her legs on a bench, utterly unaware that the last uncertain piece of their future had just been settled in a room she wasn't old enough to sit in. Marcus had 30 days to vacate the house per the judge's order, and he used nearly every one of them, moving boxes out in slow, reluctant trips that neighbors couldn't help but notice. Victoria wasn't there for most of it. Patricia had arranged the logistics, so Victoria didn't need to be there, and she found she had no appetite for watching a man pack up the life he tried to take from her. There's no satisfaction in that kind of scene, only exhaustion. Rosalind didn't wait for the 30 days. According to the same neighbor who'd kept Victoria loosely informed throughout, she left within a week of the ruling. Her boxes, the ones that had sat unpacked in the garage for over a month, still taped shut with her handwriting on the labels, were loaded into a moving truck by people who weren't Marcus. She didn't say goodbye to him in any meaningful way. Just directions to the movers. Then she was gone. The relationship apparently unable to survive the discovery that the life she'd signed up for didn't exist the way she'd been promised. I want to pause here, because this is important. Victoria didn't orchestrate any of this. She didn't leak information to anyone. She didn't post anything on social media. She didn't call any journalists or spread rumors or do any of the things people might have done if they wanted revenge. But small towns talk. Small professional circles talk. And Marcus discovered that the version of himself he'd built successful, in control, admired was more fragile than he understood. It was dependent on a story that fell apart the moment enough people learned the truth about how it ended. His firm valued discretion and reputation above almost everything else, and a messy public divorce involving a decorated army colonel, an affair, and a courtroom testimony from an 80-year-old retired attorney had generated more attention in certain circles than his employers could comfortably ignore. Victoria didn't take satisfaction in his losses, the way some people would have. 22 years in uniform teaches you that revenge is rarely as clean as people imagine it, that the people who chase it usually end up carrying more weight than the people they aimed it at. She didn't need Marcus's downfall to feel like she'd won anything, because she'd stopped measuring her life against his, the moment she'd walked out of that kitchen holding her daughter's hand. But she did insist, through Patricia, on structure. Marcus could see Emma according to the schedule the court had set, provided he showed up consistently, provided he behaved like a father instead of like a man performing fatherhood for an audience. Victoria wasn't interested in punishing him by keeping Emma from him. Whatever he'd done to her, whatever he'd tried to take, none of it changed the fact that Emma loved him, and children shouldn't inherit their parents' battles as their own. Emma asked Victoria about it one evening, weeks after the ruling, while they were unpacking the last of the boxes she'd brought back from the hotel. She was sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, arranging her stuffed animals back onto the shelf where they belonged, when she looked up at Victoria with the kind of directness only children manage. "Mom," she said, "are we really okay? Like actually okay?" Victoria sat down on the floor beside her, the carpet cool beneath her hands, and thought about how to answer honestly without giving her daughter more than an 8-year-old needed to carry. "We're finally free," she told her, and Victoria felt the truth of it settle into her chest as she said it. Solid and unshakable in a way that surprised her. Not free from difficulty. Divorce doesn't work that way. Co-parenting with Marcus would require patience for years to come. But free from the version of their life that had required her to shrink herself. Free from letting assumptions go uncorrected. Free from accepting being underestimated as the price of peace in her own home. Emma nodded slowly, seeming to accept the answer at face value the way children often do, trusting the tone more than the specific words. She went back to arranging her stuffed rabbit on the shelf, adjusting it twice until it sat exactly right. Victoria watched her with a fullness in her chest that had nothing to do with rank or property or any of the things Marcus and Rosalind had once tried to take from her. Outside, the last of the late afternoon light was slanting through the window in the same golden pattern Victoria remembered from years earlier, the day Margaret Lawson had first shown her this house, and told her without quite explaining why, that she thought it would make someone a very good home. Margaret had been right. It had just taken longer than either of them expected to become entirely hers. The first weekend after Marcus finished moving out, Victoria and Emma painted her bedroom. It hadn't been part of any grand plan, and Victoria hadn't sat down and decided this was how they'd mark the beginning of whatever came next. But Emma mentioned almost offhandedly that she wanted her walls to be a different color, something that felt like hers, instead of something that had simply always been there. They drove to the hardware store on a Saturday morning and let Emma choose from the paint chips. Her small finger traced over blues and yellows before settling on a soft, pale green that reminded Victoria, though she didn't say so, of the color of new leaves in early spring. They spent the whole afternoon on it. Drop cloth spread across the floor, both of them in old army t-shirts, 3 sizes too large, both of them with paint on their hands and faces by the time they finished the first coat. Emma wasn't particularly good at staying inside the lines, and Victoria found she didn't care. There was something in that unstructured, imperfect work rolling paint onto walls with her daughter, laughing when Emma flicked a brush too enthusiastically and caught Victoria's sleeve, that felt more like home than anything Victoria had experienced in the 11 years she'd spent trying to make a marriage work in these same rooms. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like theirs. By the following weekend, people had started stopping by. Not out of curiosity about the divorce, though some of that existed quietly beneath the surface, but out of something more generous, a kind of communal recognition that Victoria and Emma were rebuilding something, and that rebuilding is easier with company. Neighbors brought over casseroles and spare furniture they no longer needed. A few of Victoria's old colleagues from the base, people who'd known her through deployments and promotions, and the slow architecture of a military career, drove out on a Sunday afternoon to help her assemble a new bookshelf for the living room. The kind of practical, unglamorous support that means more than flowers ever could. Colonel David Morgan came by that same afternoon, still in the process of retiring, after nearly 30 years of service himself, and he stood in Victoria's newly rearranged living room with a level of pride on his face that she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. "Some people think rank is earned on the battlefield," he said, looking around at the house, at Emma chasing the neighbor's dog across the backyard through the window, at the quiet, steady life Victoria was building without anyone's permission or validation. Sometimes it's earned by surviving life with dignity, by refusing to be diminished, by holding on to yourself when everything around you is designed to take you apart. Victoria didn't have a response for that right away. She's never been especially comfortable with praise, even after 2 decades of receiving commendations and medals and the formal recognitions that come with a long career. But something about the way he said it settled into her differently than any of those ceremonies ever had. Because this wasn't about a mission completed under someone else's orders. This was about choosing deliberately and quietly to hold on to herself through something designed to strip that away. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Emma had fallen asleep exhausted from a day of running around with the neighbor's dog, Victoria took the framed photo from her promotion ceremony, the one she'd been carrying home the day everything fell apart, and hung it in the hallway near the front door, where she'd see it every time she came and went. Not as a trophy, not as proof of anything to anyone who might visit, just as a reminder to herself of what that day had actually meant, underneath everything that happened after it. Underneath the betrayal and the legal battles and the slow unwinding of someone else's mistakes. She understood something standing in that hallway that she hadn't fully grasped in the courtroom, or in the weeks of legal maneuvering, or even in the quiet satisfaction of watching Marcus's carefully built version of himself come apart under the weight of his own choices. The real victory hadn't been the house or the money, or even the vindication of watching people who'd underestimated her discover exactly how wrong they'd been. The real victory was smaller and steadier than any of that. It was Emma sleeping soundly upstairs in a green room she'd chosen herself. It was a home that finally, completely belonged to the people who actually lived in it. It was honesty. It was rest. Marcus sent a letter several months later. Handwritten. Careful. The kind of letter that suggested multiple drafts. He apologized not extensively. Not in a way that excused anything, but sincerely enough that Victoria believed he meant it. He said he understood now what he'd thrown away. That he hoped someday to be the kind of father Emma deserved, even if he no longer had any claim to being the husband she'd once needed him to be. Victoria didn't respond with anger. She didn't respond with warmth, either. She wrote back 3 sentences, thanking him for the honesty, confirming Emma's visitation schedule for the following month, and wishing him well in whatever came next for him. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut to stay closed. They just need to be left quietly, firmly in the past, while you walk forward into whatever you're building instead. The day they told her to pack her bags, they thought they were taking her home. Rosalind smiled like she was already measuring the windows for curtains. Marcus stood there like he'd already signed the paperwork in his mind. They never realized that Victoria had been carrying her real home beside her all along, holding her daughter's hand, building something they could never touch or claim or diminish, all the way back to a house that had been hers before any of them ever walked through its door. Before any of them ever thought to ask. Before any of them ever bothered to pay attention to who she actually was. I need to ask you something now, because I think what happened in Victoria's story matters to you too, even if your story looks different. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you, if you've ever had to choose between shrinking yourself and standing in your own truth, if you've ever realized that someone who claimed to love you had built their entire relationship with you on a story they invented about who you were, not on who you actually are. That moment when you understand that, that's the moment everything changes. That's when you start to see clearly. And clarity, I'm telling you, is the most powerful thing you can have. I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? And more importantly, in your own life, have you ever discovered that someone had wildly underestimated you? Have you ever had to rebuild after someone tried to take something that was always yours? Drop a comment. Tell me. Because stories like Victoria's, they're not just about one woman and one house and one moment of reckoning. They're about all of us. In the moments when we finally decide to stop performing for people who were never actually paying attention anyway. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet power of preparation and patience, if it made you angry at Marcus, or proud of Victoria, or hopeful about your own situation, subscribe. Because we share stories like this every single day. The kind of quiet, hard victories that don't always make headlines but deserve to be told. The kind of stories about real people who refuse to accept being diminished. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Austin, Texas, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.